Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Silas, your e-journalism social work advocate, host of the award-winning Kelsunn-on-the-Air social work podcast. And I'm really, really excited today to bring to you a topic that's near and dear to many in society, both here in this country and globally, and that is the topic of aging. Now, we all know that here in this country that the population is getting older and grayer, and the number of people who are stepping into senior citizenhood of baby boomers is increasing. There are a lot of statistics out there that say that the elder population is growing at a very, very fast clip, which means that there's a lot of issues and topics that need to be addressed as far as their care, their well-being, their health, and also the other side of that, which my two experts are going to discuss, is the caregiver. Okay, how do they address those issues? Because you've got families who have sons and daughters working, raising their own children, and now they're also being tasked, lovingly, I should say, with taking care of their elderly parents who are now aging and can't do the things that they used to do. So we're going to have a conversation about all the different aspects. I'd like to introduce my two esteemed guests and tell you a little bit about them. And then we're going to get into this conversation about the topic of aging and why and how it matters. First, I'd like to introduce to some and present to others Ms. Dawn Shedrick. She's an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker. She's a consultant, educator, and trainer. She founded Gentex Training and Consulting as a professional development firm for health and human service professionals. She's been her mother's primary caregiver since 1996. Welcome to the show, Dawn.
Thank you.
And then we have Dr. Tara Anglim. She's an LCSW, and she also has her accreditation as an ACHP. I'll let her explain a little bit more about that. She has spent her 30-year career working with individuals and families in a variety of systems and clinical settings. She is proud to work within healthcare for the last 12 years, currently serving as the Associate Executive Director of Culture and Experience for Peconic Bay Medical Center, Northwell Health. She began there in 2013, where she served as the Associate Director of Palliative Medicine. And so at this point, we're going to also say, welcome to the show, Dr. Anglim, and I'm so excited to have both of you here.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you and Dawn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the topic that we're talking about now, every day you turn on the TV, you go online, you hear the radio, you look in the newspaper, you see something about elder care, palliative care, hospice. And so I'm gonna give you both an opportunity to educate listeners about some of the nuances of all of these topics so that they can have more information. And as you share your information, you can also provide any links to information or phone numbers that might be helpful to those who might be in this position for the first time. So I'm going to start with you, Dawn, and I'm going to ask you to tell our listeners a little bit about the diverse needs of our diverse aging population.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Where do you begin when you talk about the needs of our aging population? And I have to say, as someone who turned the big 50 this year, like it's just even more like a part of just my own, processing, like what does it mean to, to spend more time on this earth, and what am I going to need, as I continue to age? And I think it's important for us in these conversations to realize that although there are a lot of similarities and needs in terms of, our aging, community and our aging elders, but it's also important for those of us who are supporting those who are aging, providing care in many different ways, that it's important for us to understand the diverse needs based on people's lived experiences, social identities, health issues, the impact of oppression like on them based on those social identities. And so it's one thing to talk about how do we, provide support to our aging population? But I think what's most important is for us, like you said, to like get into the nuance so that we can ensure that whatever it is that we are doing to support our aging, loved ones, our aging community, that what we are doing and what we are offering, like actually like will meet their needs.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And with that said, I'm going to then ask you, Tara, to talk a little bit to our viewers and listeners about caregiving crisis in the United States as we speak now.
Thanks, Silas. So, you mentioned when you introduced me that I was started in healthcare and palliative medicine. So I would just say that the caregiving crisis became very apparent to me in my role in palliative medicine because I was working with individuals, who were diagnosed with serious advancing illnesses. And every single person that was living with a serious disease had a family caregiver, whether that was family that was a biological family member, or if it was family of choice, like someone that was their chosen person. It's interesting to work in healthcare and to understand all the advancements we've made in healthcare for people to live longer, right? I can remember, I'm too in my 50s, Dawn, so I can remember as a child, you didn't really talk a lot or understand as a child when someone had something like serious heart disease or they had aggressive or metastatic cancer. There's so many advancements now. People can live longer, but they don't live longer without needing care. And the healthcare system in America has really developed and been built on the idea that hospitals and care centers across the continuum provide acute types of care, but the daily ongoing care for people as they age and are living with chronic or serious illness really falls on the hands, the hearts, the minds, and the wallets of the people who love them most. And I consider those people family caregivers, whether they're biological or just choice. And so the caregiving crisis currently is that we have 53 million people in the United States who are caregiving, and we're approaching a real dramatic shift in our country that we're starting to feel now as our baby boomer generation is beginning to age. And so that creates a second problem, which is who's going to care for people as they're aging. As we know, the families in America have changed a lot. People don't all live in the same places that they grew up, like maybe they did 30 or 40 years ago. And family sizes have gotten smaller. So there's less biological family members often to care than maybe 40, 30 years ago, the size of the family. And also relationships. People are often, the divorce rate in America is high, so people may not have a spouse or have a significant other that they're living with to help care for them. So as we think about this aging shift in our country, we're seeing the beginning of what's called a caregiver crisis. And you mentioned a little bit, Silas, about that sandwich generation. That's becoming much more of the norm in our society. And I believe we're going to continue to see this crisis over the next few decades as our baby boomers age.
Thank you. And you just mentioned a topic, and maybe some of our viewers and listeners are not really familiar with it. So can you explain a little bit about the term palliative?
Sure. And I love that you ask, because I make an assumption sometimes, but I forget. Most people don't know what palliative care is. So you're right, Silas. That's a good question. So palliative care it's a medical discipline that's focused with an interdisciplinary team with physicians, social workers, chaplaincy, and nurses that center around caring for people with serious or advancing illness at the beginning of diagnosis all the way through till the end. So many people know what hospice is. That's care at the end of your life. But palliative is actually care at the beginning of a serious diagnosis for a serious progressive or advancing illness to help treat symptoms and really focus on quality of life. So being a social worker, and I know Dawn and I have had many conversations around this, it's really connects very much palliative medicine to being a social worker because it's rooted in the idea of person-centered care. And that's just something as a social worker that I know is important to all of us, is understanding that it can't be the same thing for everyone. You have to really listen and find what matters most to somebody to be able to deliver on what's quality of life for them.
Thank you so much. And Dawn, talk a little bit about the diversity of caregivers who are caring for our aging population, because that brings to mind a lot of, well, who are these caregivers and what's their profiles? Talk to listeners and viewers about that.
Absolutely. I mean, so if we talk about an age cohort, right? The bulk of the family caregivers in the United States that we know of are Gen X, right? Like my generation, right? A lot of, us are also in that sandwich generation, right? I don't have any children. I don't have any human children. I have canine children. So, so I personally can't relate, but most, if not all of my peers who are caregivers are like in the sandwich generation, right? So with that, we also are spending more time on the planet. So we are, like I said about myself, we also are like advancing in age. And, I'll even say like I am navigating menopause and changes in, my creaky knees, and, I'm just more present to like how my body is changing, and just how my health, is changing as I age. But at the same time, I'm, taking care of my mom. um, Understanding the diversity of just social, even just sexual identity. Happy Pride Month, right? So there's an LGBTQ caregiver center that's, really like doing a lot of programming this month. So you have folks who identify as LGBTQ, queer, dot, 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 with all the letters. And, like one of my closest friends is a transgender male, so born female, but has transitioned and lives as a male. And he was caring for his mom who transitioned a few years ago, but he was taking care of her. And there was that complex relationship because she really struggled to accept his identity. But as she was nearing the end of her life and she had like significant, chronic and eventually terminal illnesses, he showed up for his mom. He was supporting his mother. He, like was working full time and taking care of his mother around the clock. Was also financially supporting his mother while caring for her, but at the same time had to navigate, her struggle with his trans identity. And so for like many people, who have that experience, it's like whether they want to or whether they, do it out of love or not, they do it and they're providing care, but they also have to, navigate any transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, right? Um, the same thing goes, for folks of different racial and ethnic identities, right? So they're trying to, and I can, relate to this, contending with a system, that a healthcare system in particular that many of us know, especially professionals, academics, researchers, we know the data, we know about health disparities, we know how that impacts, folks' health. And many of the people that we're taking care of, you know, aren't directly impacted by that. There's also data that tells us that the Latina community and the Black African American community of caregivers also bear like a disproportionate financial burden when it comes to caregiving, whether it's meeting expenses that are not met by insurance, whether it's the cost of having to take off from work, having to engage, in other ways with the system. And so that's why it's important, especially again, for those of us who are providing care, for those of us who are, creating solutions in our research and scholarship, to understand that we can't just offer, blanket interventions. If we really want to have an impact on this caregiver crisis, and I could not agree with that designation more, then we have to be able to meet the needs of the people who are providing care. And that's an incredibly diverse community.
Thank you. And Tara, I want to turn to you and ask you to elaborate a little bit on the supporting the needs of family caregivers across the healthcare continuum. Caregiver centers as a model. So what is that looking like? And explain that to our audience, please.
So first of all, I just I love everything that Dawn just said. I just have to, I can't not add to what she said. I just think in terms of the most disenfranchised populations are often the ones that are taking the largest hit in terms of impact to their income in jobs they have to take, in terms of the resources they utilize. They're often a group that resources are not actually making it to them in the early, when they take on the caregiver role till much later. So I love everything Dawn said. I think it's not talked about enough, because the way we engage the solutions is by really talking to the family caregivers themselves. And I know Dawn's been a staunch advocate, and I'm grateful for that, because you only come to stuff with your own lens. You have to really listen there's so much diversity in terms of populations of caregivers, and also diversity in the situations of caregiving. They're so different. So I think that poses a lot of challenges. When you ask about programming, I think that's a piece why historically programs have been originally very disease specific connected programs. And what we're starting to see, and I'm so excited to see, is that we're seeing more caregiver focused programs that are not specific to disease, but are starting to really understand that being a family caregiver is a distinctly different role than being a family member. I know lots of people who are adult children. The ones that have never been a family caregiver have no idea, even when I tell them the kind of work I do, what it means to be a caregiver. And you talk to someone for about 30 seconds who's been a family caregiver, and they immediately say, I wish I would have had that kind of support when I was caregiving. So the programs, what we're seeing and what there's a lot of funding and research about, are more caregiver directed programs that are moving a little bit away from the disease specific, like focused around what the patient is living with, because populations are aging and people over 65 are living with one or more chronic advancing illnesses. So, as diverse as population is a caregiver, so is the complexity of caregiving, because you can have multiple things going on for a person you're caring for. So the caregiver programs that I am most excited about, and I'm a little biased, as Dawn already knows, is we have caregiver centers that started as a model in New York. They started, the first caregiver center in the country in a hospital was opened in 2007 by Marion Hamilton. It's called the Ken Hamilton Caregiver Center, and it opened in Mount Cisco up in Northern Westchester at Northern Westchester Hospital. And she was actually the family caregiver for her husband, who had metastatic advancing lung cancer. And she was caring for their children while caring for him. And her experience was that he received so much care throughout the continuum, but she received no care as his caregiver. And so when her husband, passed away, she felt so changed by that experience. She I remember talking to her, and she told me a story how she remembered he was in the hospital at one point for several weeks, and she walked in and out of a hospital every single day, passing and seeing the same people, and no one addressed her. And she just felt invisible. And so what she did from her experience was she really rallied people together from a philanthropy standpoint, and started the Ken Hamilton Caregiver Center, where she used volunteers like herself, people who had been family caregivers, that then wanted to come back and kind of volunteer their time to help support new family caregivers who were in the healthcare continuum. And Ken Hamilton's Caregiver Center is in a hospital. So that was the model that opened in the first in the country, and I really replicated that. And when I went and met with Marion and the team there, Jerry was the social worker and Maria Hale, I was inspired by something that I had never seen before. In palliative medicine, I was doing caregiver support groups, I was running a telephone support program, but I never saw a physical space or even thought that could be something. And so with their mentorship, I was really proud to open the Caregiver Center at Peconic Bay in 2018. And since then, I've helped to peer support along with Ken Hamilton Caregiver Center. There's now we're up to the 10th Caregiver Center across New York.
Wow. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with our audience. And then as you were speaking, I was just thinking about the story that you shared about Ms. Hamilton, who, felt invisible, and the fact that she was giving care and she wasn't getting any care. So, Dawn, that brings me to the point that I'd like you to expound on, and then I can swing back to you, Tara, to talk about caregiver mental health and stressors. Because if anybody that's been a caregiver, it's a huge amount of mental, emotional, and psychological stress. So talk about that from that standpoint, please, Dawn.
Absolutely. And, as has been one of the themes in this conversation, right? There's like so much nuance, in terms of the psychological stress of, caregiver and caregiver burden, right? So, and, I will be completely honest, like I've experienced a lot of this, throughout my journey, everything from, just the sadness of watching someone that you love, like who is chronically ill, who is disabled, who is in pain, who, may have officially been told that, that they are, coming to the end of their life. And so there's that sadness, there's that anticipatory grief, right? That comes along with that while you are also providing care at the same moment, at the same time, because many caregivers share, this certainly has been my experience, that, in the conditioning around providing care, whether it's as a family caregiver or even as a professional caregiver, but certainly as a family caregiver, we are conditioned to prioritize, the person, who we're caring for, and to prioritize their needs, to prioritize their wellness and their care. And so we often just push our own, feelings and thoughts, to the side and suppress them in many cases. And so, additional psychological stresses, there could be resentment for caregivers who are not receiving support particularly from family, whether chosen, or biological family. The overwhelm, the guilt of, which again, I can tell on myself about that, in terms of the guilt when I go on vacation. There are times where I've gone on vacation or I've gone out of town and, my mother had to go to the hospital. My mother wasn't feeling well. Like there are times where I felt guilty about feeling guilty, or even just leaving the house, sometimes if my mother, generally has not been, doing well in a particular period of time. And so, the guilt in itself, can be a huge, impact, mentally, psychologically, emotionally. Um, the feeling of isolation, and feelings of isolation can be physical isolation, right? I have a friend, a former classmate who's a caregiver who is living in a rural community because they returned home to care for their father, right? So they could be the physical, and they don't have any siblings. They're an only child, and both parents were only children, right? So they literally don't have access to family to support them. And because of this, the geographical isolation, there's a lot, that they're bearing. But there also is the social isolation, because many times we feel like either nobody understands, nobody wants to support me, and maybe we've even asked for support and haven't received it. We don't want to complain to people. I know that comes up for me a lot. I don't want people to think that like I'm a broken record. Thank goodness for my therapist, over the years. So when you think about just that small sample that like I've shared, and for many people who like have a compounded experience of that, it is incredibly overwhelming and distressing. We know that there's data out there that tell us that, in that 53 or at least 53 million population of family caregivers in the United States, there's data that tells us that anywhere from 40 to up to 70% of them in any one given calendar year experience at least a minimum of features of depression and anxiety. So not only, do people experience distress, there are many who, as a result, of caregiver stress and burden and everything that comes with that, like literally are experiencing, you know, diagnosable, forms of depression and anxiety.
Okay, thank you. Tara, would you like to add to that? And then that's something I want you to really expound on.
I've had the privilege to spend, more than the last 10 years with family caregivers. And I think what, I literally, even my research with family caregivers, I have to say it was an epiphany, was hearing family caregivers explain that you have to give up something to become a caregiver. And in that, regardless of thinking of like anticipatory grief in terms of loss of life or loss of, losing the person you love, there's just loss from the beginning in caregiving in terms of loss of freedom for caregivers, loss of the ability to make decisions without thinking about someone else. Like Dawn said, like that's, really something that I've been so interested in my research because it's come up so many times, prioritization of others over self. It's, for family caregivers, it's just how they live. And I think when you think about grief, right, if I said to you, Silas, like, oh my goodness, I just lost the person I love the most and I'm really struggling, you would say to me, it would be very normal for you to say to me, you should go talk to somebody. Like you should go, Dawn talked about it, you should go talk to someone, you should go to a bereavement group, but we don't think that same way when someone tells us that their parent just had a serious stroke and they can't live on their own anymore and they're caregiving for them. We say, oh, I'm so sorry. We don't think about how that's going to impact also, though, the person who's caring for them, who loves them so much. And so I think we just need to understand that these things, depression or anxiety, are part of taking on this responsibility. It doesn't mean that there isn't also joy. And I know Dawn and I have had many conversations about this, because to me, being a caregiver is it's like an ethic of love. You do it out of something that says, for you, who you are, what was important, what's your family values, what's the values for yourself that you brought up. So there's a positive from that, but that positive and those things like depression and anxiety and stress, those both things can be true at the very same time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the part that people need to understand about caregiving, because it isn't that, like Dawn said, I feel bad, sometimes even saying I don't want to be a broken record, but you're not a broken record ever. You're just saying the truth. The two things can be true at the very same time. You can love your mother and be so grateful for the time with her and proud to be able to be there to care for her. And you can also feel completely exhausted and sometimes really sad about, the situation she's in and the situation you're in and having to care for her. So I think that's just really important for people to start to open their minds to. When someone tells you someone they love is sick or ill and they're caring for them, you have to really think of what does that person need, who's not the identified patient, what does that caregiver need? So it could be as little as just calling them and asking them how they're doing. It could be as small as asking them if, can you drop off dinner? Or I always tell people, don't ask them what you can do, just show up. Because a lot of times I've found family caregivers have told me, no, I don't need anything. And then when I extend without asking, they're always so appreciative because it doesn't give them the opportunity to really say no for small things. I mean, don't insert yourself into someone's home at bedtime. That's not a great thing for a family caregiver. They'll get upset. I will say, think of what things you can do for someone who's really trying to do everything for someone they love. And, we all get breaks from our jobs, but family caregivers don't get breaks. There's no sick day. There's no vacation time. Even when people get a little bit of what we call respite, their brain doesn't shut off from worrying or thinking about their loved one. And I just think, we needed to, as a society, as a community of people that care about people, understand how we can think of family caregivers and understand it's something that we really should all be more open to asking how we can support them.
Once again, this is Silas, your e-journalism social work advocate, producer and host of the show. You've been listening to the award-winning Kelsunn-on-the-Air social work podcast.